Hello and welcome to another episode of Blurbal Reasoning, where today we are going to be talking about the first Book of Swords. As long-time viewers of the channel may or may not be aware, I have been reading through the Wheel of Time series, and while I am currently in the middle of book 10, I wanted a break, but something still fantasy focused. And there was an episode of Brandon Sanderson and Dan Wells' podcast, Intentionally Blank, where they were talking about books that they really admired in the fantasy genre, and one of the ones that came up was the first Book of Swords, and it really intrigued me, so I thought I would take a look. I consume most of my books via Audible nowadays, but I decided to switch things up a bit and go back to ebook this time around. I'm one of those people who has a much harder time keeping their attention span honed in on a book as an adult than they did when they were younger, but I've kind of been retraining my brain to bedtime's for reading time, mostly. It also helps that this book is 200 pages and not 800. The first Book of Swords takes place in a world where it's kind of like a general fantasy setting, but you get the impression that it's a civilization that exists in our world, in the real world, just very, very far into the future, and I'm a big fan of that particular fantasy trope. It's also a world of gods, demons, and magic, although in a less, I would say, corporeal sense than you might expect. They're not ethereal. They are there, but it's not like you've got mages everywhere you turn weaving fantastic spells. Like, magic is there, but it's not flaunted, I guess would be the way to say it. That being said, the main driving plot point of this book is the fact that the gods have forged these magical swords and given them to humankind for some sort of game which we don't know much about yet. I'd like to talk a little bit about the writing style, because jumping from Wheel of Time to the Books of Swords novels was actually quite a switch, quite a shift in writing direction in my opinion. Whereas Robert Jordan in the Wheel of Time series dedicates endless amounts of words to subtleties within character movement, like they're shifting their skirts or adjusting their shawl to kind of emphasize how they feel, and there's endless amounts of extra characters in the background. In fact, there's almost records amounts of extra characters in the background, and that's not a criticism, by the way. I find that there is merit to that approach. It just takes a long time to get through. Fred Saberhagen contrasts this by having a much kind of not a smaller world, but a smaller cast of characters, a much more matter-of-fact and to-the-point way of writing about these characters and this world. Nothing is introduced ahead of its time, really, and on the one hand I found this very refreshing, because it meant that the pacing of the book felt a lot better than what I've been used to for the last few years in terms of fantasy fiction. But on the other hand, I did find myself wanting a little bit more detail by the end of it, because I do like the characters, but they're very basic, they're very simple. Again, not a bad thing, but you don't really get to feel much of their feelings. You don't really get to see the world through their eyes. It's definitely more of this is the world as presented by an omniscient narrator, I guess. But if you, like me, have been reading these massive epic fantasy novel series for a while, you probably will find this really refreshing. I will now be veering into spoiler territory, so if you've yet to read the book for yourself, I would jump ship now. Just know that my general impressions on the book are, I really enjoyed it, and I plan to continue through the series. So let's start with my impressions of the characters. We've got Mark as kind of our fairly standard young protagonist, who things just kind of happen to. When we do see the world through his eyes, it's very much one of not necessarily innocence, but inexperience. Again, we don't get much of an inner monologue for any character in this book. There's some stuff there, I'm not saying it's completely gone, but compared to other writing styles, I guess. Mark does befriend Ben and Barbara and Nestor being the most interesting of the three. Ben and Barbara are just kind of there. Barbara kind of takes charge when it's just the three of them without Nestor, and Ben is kind of presented as this not all that intelligent kind of a guy, but I never really got a sense of friendship between the three of them. I didn't really get a sense of a bond forming, and I think that's because a lot of the stuff that would have entailed that kind of took place, I was going to say off camera or off screen, but that doesn't really work for a book. You get told things like, oh, and then they travel to kind Sir Andrew's kingdom, and that took them a few days, and at some point Mark decided to reveal his true identity to them, and they kind of had already guessed that something was going on, but it's not a scene, it's just kind of told to us. And that kind of thing happens a lot throughout the book. Nestor is this fun kind of like older brother kind of a figure. Like you get the sense, and maybe I misread this or I forgot this, but you get the sense that he's older than the other characters, but not that much older. He's still got his own journey to go on. He's still got his own life experiences to discover. So when he's among Mark and his friends, he's very much the leader and like the learned, experienced one among them, but he does get his own portion of the book where he meets Druffian, the beast god. I believe he's the beast lord or the beast god, I forget how he's described. But that was a really fun portion of the book where we kind of got to learn more about Nestor, or maybe not learn all that much about him, but kind of like see the world through his eyes and have a little side adventure with him. We see how he deals with the Grey Host, we see how he's a capable fighter without even the magic of the sword, but obviously when Townsaver does activate, that's wielded very capably in anyone's hands. It's kind of the magic that we're given to believe that the sword power has. It feels like there's kind of a missing scene when Nestor returns to the trio of characters, because he gets carried off by a dragon and then he talks to Druffian and learns about the Grey Host and all this stuff about the gods, and then Druffian takes him back, and then like there's no kind of like welcome back scene or anything like that, even though Mark at that point is very worried about his sword Townsaver, which he considers to be his sword. Later on, Nestor is wielding that, and there's nothing from Mark about, but what about my sword? So again, it does feel like there's some stuff that could have been expanded upon there, but I'm overly criticizing a book that I really enjoyed. I always do this. I really enjoyed Duke Fractin as a villain. He felt almost cartoonish in a way, not that he was particularly funny, but like, he's quite simple-minded, he's quite... he sees the worst in everyone, he expects the worst from everyone, and while he is able to put on this kind of kind face when talking to Mark's parents, for example, he does eventually turn around and I think he locks them up. I did read the first 30% of this book a few months ago. And then you've got the antithesis of Duke Fractin, which is kind Sir Andrew, who wants to see the best in everyone, and that's kind of his foil, where sometimes, he spends time reading to prisoners hoping that he can educate them and change their ways, and then eventually that almost turns around and bites him in the arse towards the end of the novel. Now, to give a quick overview of the swords of which I am currently aware in this series, there is of course Townsaver, which gives the user fantastic fighting ability and apparently immortality when a group of people need protecting, which is a very arbitrary kind of a magic. Like, how is the sword supposed to know when it's supposed to activate? I kind of like that it's that arbitrary level of magic. You've got Dragon Slicer, which is good at killing dragons, and dragons in this book aren't always these massive winged lizard fire-breathing creatures that we're used to. Sometimes they're basically frogs. In fact, when a winged dragon does appear halfway through the novel, it's a major surprise because nobody's really seen one before. Not to dip into the lore portion of this video too early, but I do really like the idea that this is a world that's so far in the future that ideas of the myths of the past do kind of embody themselves in the reality of the present, but because so much time has passed, they're a little bit warped in the way that you would expect them to be. Dragons can basically be frogs. You can have gods called Mars and Vulcan and stuff like that, but they're not really going to represent what those gods originally stood for, maybe, although Mars did pretty much seem to be the embodiment of war, so I guess we'll learn more about that later. But not even mythology. The ruler of one realm is called Duke Fractin, and the ruler of another is called Sir Andrew, and these aren't titles, well, apart from the Duke, I guess, but these aren't titles that would usually have ruling over an entire kingdom, so you can kind of see how titles and expectations of a world that we know have been warped in the amount of time it's taken to get to this era of the world, which I find really cool. Anyway, there's also a Sword of Illusions. I don't think it's called that. I forget what it's called. We didn't see much from it. Mark wielded it at one point, and then he stabbed it in a dragon that flew it back to Duke Fractin, but he never used it, so I don't really know what happened there. I guess that'll probably come up again in book 2. And then finally we have Coin Spinner, which is a sword that changes the user's luck, which I find to be a really fun idea for a sword, because, it's cool that these are swords, but they're not necessarily all about this sword can cut through steel or whatever. This sword's really good at killing dragons, the most boring sword that we've met so far. Although I think Druffian might have hinted that it had some other properties that we don't know about yet. I don't know. But I also worry that Coin Spinner could end up being kind of a MacGuffin in terms of it's okay, Mark has the Sword of Luck now, it'll save him, even though it didn't do a very good job of saving Duke Fracton at the end of a novel because he dropped it. And finally, to talk about Valor, I've already kind of touched on it here, but I really love how this world is set at least 50,000 years into the future in a world that is no longer recognizable as our own. But that does allow Saberhagen to throw in the occasional, like, a relic of the old world, and it's like a lamp or something, or a torch, which I don't think would be working after 50,000 years, but it's kind of cool anyway. Maybe there's an old world, somewhere more recently in the past that's still long after the fall of civilization or whatever. I love towards the end of a book when we get Druffian's perspective, and it's revealed that he doesn't know who these upstart gods are, who name themselves after ancient myths of humankind which have long been forgotten, such as Mars and Vulcan. I love how it's basically revealed that Druffian used to be like a dog, basically, before he entered, I forget what it's called, like the Cave of Life or the Pool of Life or whatever it was that gave him and Ardnet or whoever, like, their godlike powers. Very, very curious to learn more about that lore. If you know more about that lore, please do not tell me. I would like to learn it for myself. But yeah, that's about gonna do it for this fairly quick Blurbal reasoning on the first Book of Swords. I will continue reading through the series. If anyone's concerned that I've stopped reading Wheel of Time, it is literally still something that I am listening through. So there will be a Blurbal reasoning on that. I think I'm more than halfway through the 10th book, but it's quite the endeavour, and it is one I mean to see through no matter how long it takes me. But I was getting really down about not having anything else to read while I was trying to get my way through this extremely long series, which is why I read books alongside the Wheel of Time now. Thank you very much for listening. Let me know what you thought about the book if you like, and I will see you in whatever I make next.